let's find out a little bit about how the Paleolithic world becomes the Neolithic world. It's important to have an idea about the timeline involved. The Paleolithic period is enormous, and it covers between 20,000 BCE to 8,000 BCE. This is a period before history and writing. It's also pre-agriculture. So during this period, for the humans, the genus Homo, there was no separation between the sacred and the profane. Humans lived with the divine, which centered around the tree, the mountain, the pole, places that you could rise up to, that had their grounding in the earth, but reached to the heavens, thus linking heaven and earth. The Neolithic period starts around 8,000 BCE and goes to 4,000 BCE. So this is a relatively short period of time, specifically when we consider how long it took us to get there. This is a period where history begins to develop because writing develops. It's also a period where agriculture is invented. And so now we get to this period where we have domesticated animals, and we've domesticated wheat, which means that we no longer need to roam and go where the food is. We can bring the food to us. So human and animal sacrifice begin to represent this hierogamy. Hierogamy is a fancy word that simply means a sacred marriage. And the marriage now is between the soil, traditionally represented as female, and the seeds, traditionally represented as male. And so human sexuality, in turn, becomes this same kind of divine moment. The mythologies of the Fertile Crescent are particularly important to us because this is what we consider the cradle of human civilization. The Fertile Crescent is the place between the Tigris and the Euphrates, located in what's probably today modern Iraq. And this is where we start to see the Babylonian mythology. Well, we see Sumerian, Akkadian, and then ultimately Babylonian mythologies develop. So as we progress through the Neolithic period and into the early civilizations, height is still a mystical symbol of the divine. So think about Moses meeting God at the top of the mountain and acquiring the Ten Commandments. Flight, similarly, also represents transcendence from the human condition. Think about, you might remember the story of Icarus, whose father makes wings for him, but he flies too close to the sun. The wax binding the feathers together melts, and Icarus falls to his death. So this is another sort of coming of age story where the child isn't really ready to handle the adult world, and as he flies too close to the sun, gaining understanding, knowledge, wisdom, it's too much for him, and so it destroys him. Height is intended to represent spiritual enlightenment. Obviously, Icarus isn't ready for it. But the Hebrew culture introduces a disgust with the sexual sacred, particularly in the Genesis text. So think about what Armstrong writes. She says that the loss of the primordial paradisal state is experienced as a falling into agriculture. This is something you can see in the story of Adam and Eve when they are expelled from the garden. One of their punishments is that they have to toil the land. So they are no longer able to roam the garden finding the food. Now they have to stay where they are, and they have to try to extract food from the soil. Remember that the Fertile Crescent is also part of this river basin between the Tigris and the Euphrates. So their myths became focused on the struggle between order and chaos. And so the myths and their seeming erratic flooding that was remarkably destructive represented in turn this fragmentation between what human order was doing and what divine order was expecting. As these early civilizations began to develop, so too did conflicting mythologies, and the city and its representation became an example of one of these kinds of conflicting mythologies. So we talked about the conflict between the the idea of the flood mythology in Babylon and in the Fertile Crescent, think about Egypt. So if we travel down out of the Middle East and into Africa, we encounter the Nile River and Egypt. And the Egyptian mythologies characterized their flood myths by their relationship with the Nile. So similarly to the Babylonians, who characterized their myths with the Tigris and the Euphrates, the Egyptians characterized theirs by the behavior of the Nile, which flooded regularly and created fertile growing conditions. So you can see that their relationship to the flood mythologies and what they represented is very different than the Mesopotamians, where the Tigris and the Euphrates were unpredictable and destructive. Life was far less secure, and flooding became a metaphor for political and social dissolution. And so the floods there began to represent that crisis in the divine-human relationships. The biblical writers also saw civilization as a sign from the separation from God. So cities, for them, were places of evil. Think about what happens in these cities. Of course, you have denser populations, which means you're more likely to experience conflict among your neighbors. And so, while the mountains in the Paleolithic period and the trees were representations of a way to access the divine, for the biblical writers, the ziggurat represented human arrogance. So these man-made mountains were like the Tower of Babylon, things that were not to be honored or revered. Whereas the Babylonians, at the same time, saw cities as a place to encounter the divine. They saw cities as holy places that partook in the divine creativity. And they also saw human sexuality as a participation in divine creativity. So the ziggurat was a place of divinity, particularly at the very top, where the temple was often located. So what does that mean for Cain and Abel? Well, in the Cain and Abel story, this myth describes the Hebrew attitudes toward the Neolithic developments that led to the early civilizations that were centered around urban life. So the two brothers offer sacrifices. One, in Abel's case, represents the older Paleolithic nomadic lifestyle in the form of shepherding. The other represents this new agricultural lifestyle in the form of the farmer's fruits and vegetables. So Abel offers a sheep, whereas Cain offers wheat or vegetables from his fields. God accepts Abel's sacrifice, but rejects Cain's, suggesting that these new early civilizations in this culture were being considered places of infidelity to the divine. So Abel's sacrifice is that of the nomadic shepherding lifestyle of the Paleolithic world, whereas Cain's is that of the farmer, and it's the sedentary lifestyle of the Neolithic world and the civilizations that developed as a result. Thus, part of Cain's punishment is to wander. And he ultimately establishes a city named for his own son, Enoch. The city, like his son, is his offspring or his legacy, suggesting that there's something fundamental or inherently problematic with cities. And I'd like to leave you with this image that is from the Tate Gallery, and it's a depiction of the Cain and Abel aftermath. And I want you to notice that here Cain seems to genuinely regret his actions. You can see that in the agonized look on his face and his attempts to hold his brother up. You can also see that he has what appears to be a jawbone. In the mythologies that developed around this story, Cain is said to have killed his brother with a jawbone. So the story isn't about the first death. Death is clearly already part of the world. It's about the first murder and mankind's obligation to one another.